There is a certain feeling that arises when you say yes to something you don't want. This feeling manifests as a slight tightness in your chest or a quiet discomfort settling somewhere in the background of your awareness. You may not notice it right away. You may not even be able to name it. But it is there, waiting, reminding you that something inside you has been ignored. Hello and welcome. Today's audiobooks video topic is Stop People Pleasing and Set Boundaries. Before we get to the video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Chapter 1: The Hidden Cost of People Pleasing. There is a particular feeling that arises when you say yes to something you do not want to do. It shows up as a faint tension in your chest, or a quiet discomfort that settles somewhere in the background of your awareness. You may not notice it immediately. You may not even name it. But it is there, waiting, reminding you that something inside you has been bypassed. This is not about whether the action itself is good or bad. It is not about whether the other person deserves your help or your time. It is about what happens inside you when you agree to something that does not align with what you actually feel or need. It is about the small erosion that takes place each time you prioritize someone else's comfort over your own clarity. This is not about whether the action itself is good or bad. It is not about whether the other person deserves your help or your time. It is about what happens inside you when you agree to something that does not align with what you actually feel or need. It is about the small erosion that takes place each time you prioritize someone else's comfort over your own clarity. And here is what makes it complicated. Often, it feels good to say yes. There is a warmth that comes with being helpful. There is a sense of connection that arises when someone smiles at you with gratitude. There is relief in knowing that you have avoided conflict, that you have kept things smooth, that you have not disappointed anyone. In that moment, it feels like the right choice. It feels like kindness. It feels like care. But underneath that warmth, something else is happening. You are learning, quietly and without realizing it, that your worth is tied to how well you meet the needs of others. You are reinforcing the idea that your value depends on your willingness to accommodate, to adjust, to make things easier for everyone around you. And over time, this becomes your default way of moving through the world. It becomes automatic. You stop questioning it. You stop noticing the cost. This is not something you consciously choose. It is something that develops slowly, through repetition, through the accumulation of small moments where you put yourself aside in order to keep things flowing. And because it feels good in the short term, because it reduces tension and earns approval, it becomes deeply embedded in how you relate to others and to yourself. The challenge is that this pattern does not remain isolated to one area of your life. It spreads. It influences how you show up in relationships, how you make decisions, how you interpret your own feelings. It shapes the way you think about what you deserve, what you are allowed to want, and what you are allowed to refuse. And because it happens gradually, you may not realize how much of yourself has been quietly set aside until you notice that you no longer know what you actually want, separate from what others expect of you. This is the hidden cost. It is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It is simply the slow fading of your own voice, the gradual loss of your ability to know and honor what is true for you. And it happens not because you are weak, but because you have learned, at some point, that being agreeable is safer than being honest. When you look back at your early experiences, you may begin to see where this pattern first took shape. You may notice moments when your feelings were dismissed, or when expressing a preference led to tension, or when being cooperative earned you warmth and attention that you desperately needed. These moments taught you something. They taught you that approval is conditional, that love is something you earn, and that the best way to stay safe and connected is to be what others need you to be. This is not a conscious lesson. No one sat you down and explained it. But children are incredibly perceptive. They learn by observing what happens when they act in certain ways. If expressing a need leads to frustration or rejection, they learn to suppress that need. If being compliant brings relief and affection, they learn to prioritize compliance. And over time, these lessons become part of their internal framework, shaping how they understand relationships and their place within them. The environment you grew up in plays a significant role in this. In some families, expressing disagreement is seen as disrespect. In others, emotional needs are dismissed as inconvenient or dramatic. In some cases, there is simply not enough space for everyone's feelings, and the child learns that the way to contribute is to take up less room, to ask for less, to make things easier. And in doing so, they begin to lose touch with their own inner sense of what feels right or wrong for them. This does not mean that the adults in your life were intentionally harmful. Often, they were simply repeating patterns they themselves had learned. They may have been overwhelmed, or emotionally unavailable, or deeply uncomfortable with conflict. And in that environment, the child who adapts, who smooths things over, who does not make waves, becomes the one who feels safest. But that safety comes at a price. It comes at the cost of learning that your own needs are secondary, that your feelings are negotiable, and that the most important thing is to keep others comfortable. As you grow older, this pattern does not disappear. It evolves. It becomes more sophisticated. You learn to anticipate what others want before they ask. You learn to adjust your tone, your opinions, your preferences to match the energy in the room. You learn to read subtle cues and respond in ways that minimize tension. And on the surface, this may look like social skill, like emotional intelligence, like kindness. But underneath, it is often something else. It is a protective strategy, a way of ensuring that you remain acceptable, that you do not lose connection, that you do not become a burden. The difficulty is that this strategy works, at least in the short term. People do respond positively when you are agreeable. They do appreciate your flexibility. They do feel comfortable around you. And so the behavior is reinforced over and over until it becomes so automatic that you no longer recognize it as a choice. It simply becomes who you are, or at least, who you believe you need to be in order to be loved. But there is a cost that accumulates quietly over time. Each time you agree to something that does not feel right, a small part of you retreats. Each time you suppress your own needs in favor of someone else's comfort, you lose a little more contact with your own inner guidance. And eventually, you may find yourself in a state where you no longer know what you actually want, because you have spent so long focusing on what others want from you. This is not about blaming yourself for this pattern. It is about recognizing it clearly, without judgment, so that you can begin to see how it operates in your life. It is about understanding that people-pleasing is not a flaw in your character. It is a learned response, a survival mechanism that once served a purpose. And like all survival mechanisms, it made sense in the context where it was formed. But that does not mean it still serves you now. One of the most challenging aspects of this pattern is that it feels so much like love. It feels like care. It feels like generosity. And in some ways, it is. But it is also a form of self-abandonment. Because when you consistently prioritize the needs and feelings of others over your own, you are teaching yourself that your own experience does not matter as much. You are reinforcing the belief that your value depends on how well you perform for others, rather than on the simple fact of your existence. And this belief has consequences. It affects how you set boundaries, or whether you set them at all. It affects how you respond to criticism, how you interpret rejection, how you navigate conflict. It affects your ability to say no, to express disagreement, to protect your time and energy. It affects your sense of self-worth, because when your worth is tied to external approval, it becomes unstable. It shifts depending on how others respond to you. And that leaves you constantly scanning for feedback, constantly adjusting, constantly performing. This is exhausting. It is exhausting to always be monitoring the emotional temperature of the room. It is exhausting to always be ready to adjust yourself in order to keep things smooth. It is exhausting to live in a state where your own feelings are something you have to manage quietly, privately, without burdening anyone else. And over time, this exhaustion becomes a background hum in your life, something you get so used to that you forget it is even there. But it is there. And it shows up in various ways. It shows up as resentment that you do not fully understand, because you agreed to something, so why do you feel upset about it? It shows up as a vague sense of emptiness, as if something important is missing but you cannot quite name what it is. It shows up as a feeling of being invisible, even when you are surrounded by people who care about you. It shows up as confusion about your own preferences, Because you have spent so long adapting to others that you have lost the thread of what you actually like, want, or need. And perhaps most painfully, it shows up in your relationships. Because when you are constantly adjusting yourself to fit what you think others need, you are not actually letting them see you. You are showing them a version of yourself that has been carefully edited to be acceptable, to be easy, to be lovable. And while this may keep things comfortable in the short term, it also prevents real intimacy. Because intimacy requires honesty. It requires showing up as you are, with your needs and your boundaries and your imperfections. And if you are always performing, always managing, always accommodating, then what others are connecting with is not really you. It is the version of you that you think will keep them close. This is the paradox. You engage in people-pleasing because you fear losing connection, but in doing so, you prevent the kind of connection you actually long for. You fear that if you show your true feelings, if you express a need, if you set a boundary, others will pull away. And so you make yourself smaller, easier, more accommodating. But in doing so, you create a distance between who you are and what you show. And that distance, over time, becomes a source of deep loneliness. It is important to understand that this loneliness is not because you are doing something wrong. It is simply the natural consequence of living in a way that is disconnected from your own truth. When you are always adjusting to fit external expectations, you lose touch with your internal compass. And without that compass, you cannot navigate toward what actually nourishes you. You end up in situations that drain you, with people who take more than they give, doing things that do not align with who you are, all because you have learned that saying yes is safer than risking the discomfort of saying no. And here is where it becomes especially difficult. Because saying no, or setting a boundary, or expressing a need, does not feel safe. It feels dangerous. It feels like you are risking rejection, conflict, or loss. And depending on how deeply this pattern is embedded, the idea of prioritizing your own needs may feel selfish, or wrong, or like a betrayal of the people you care about. This is not irrational. This is the voice of the part of you that learned, long ago, that your safety depends on being what others need. But that part of you, while trying to protect you, is also keeping you trapped. It is keeping you in a state where your worth is always contingent, where your peace depends on external approval, where your sense of self is constantly shifting to meet the expectations of others. And as long as that pattern remains unexamined, it will continue to shape your life in ways that prevent you from experiencing the stability, clarity, and self-respect that come from living in alignment with your own truth. This is not about suddenly becoming someone who does not care about others. It is not about rejecting kindness or generosity. It is about recognizing that true care, true connection, true generosity can only arise when you are also caring for yourself. When you are also honoring your own needs. When you are also protecting your own energy and clarity. Because if you are constantly giving from a place of depletion, from a place of fear, from a place of needing approval, then what you are offering is not truly free. It is transactional. It is conditional. And on some level, you know this. And that knowing adds to the exhaustion. So the question is not whether you should care about others. The question is whether you are willing to include yourself in that care. Whether you are willing to treat your own needs with the same respect you offer to everyone else. Whether you are willing to stop abandoning yourself in the name of keeping others comfortable. And this is not easy. It requires something that may feel unfamiliar, even frightening. It requires you to turn your attention inward, to notice what you actually feel, to honor what you actually need, even when it conflicts with what others want from you. This is where the real work begins. Not in trying to force yourself to change, not in criticizing yourself for how you have been living, but in simply beginning to notice. In beginning to see how often you say yes when you mean no. How often you suppress what you feel in order to maintain harmony. How often you adjust yourself, dim yourself, make yourself smaller, all in service of an approval that never quite feels secure enough. And as you begin to notice, without judgment, you may also begin to see that this pattern is not who you are. It is something you learned. It is something you developed in response to circumstances that required you to adapt in order to survive. And that means it is also something that can shift. Not all at once. Not through force. But gradually, through awareness, through practice, through the repeated choice to honor what is true for you, even when it feels uncomfortable. This is not about becoming perfect at setting boundaries or never feeling the pull to accommodate others. It is about developing a different relationship with yourself, one where your own feelings and needs are given weight, are treated as valid, are included in the equation. It is about learning that your worth is not something you have to earn, that your value does not depend on how much you give or how well you perform. It is about discovering that you can be loved, truly loved, not for what you do, but for who you are. And this discovery does not happen in one moment. It unfolds slowly, through the accumulation of small choices, small moments where you choose honesty over accommodation, where you choose clarity over comfort, where you choose to stay connected to yourself even when it means risking someone else's disappointment. And each time you make that choice, you are building something. You are building a foundation of self-respect, a foundation that does not shift depending on external approval, a foundation that allows you to move through the world with a quiet confidence that comes from knowing who you are and what you stand for. This is what it means to begin recovering from people-pleasing. Not by rejecting others, not by becoming cold or selfish, but by including yourself in your own care. By recognizing that you matter, not because of what you do, but simply because you exist. By learning that your needs are not an inconvenience, your feelings are not a burden, and your boundaries are not a form of rejection. They are simply the way you take care of yourself, the way you protect your energy, the way you stay connected to what is true. And as you begin to live this way, something shifts. The relationships that were built on your constant accommodation may change. Some may deepen, as the people who truly care about you appreciate the honesty and realness that comes from you no longer performing. Others may fade, as it becomes clear that what was being valued was not you, but what you were willing to do. And while this can be painful, it is also clarifying. Because it shows you where real connection exists, and where it does not. This is the hidden cost of people-pleasing that no one talks about. It is not just the exhaustion, or the resentment, or the confusion about who you are. It is the quiet loss of yourself, the gradual fading of your own voice, the slow erosion of your ability to know and honor what is true for you. And the only way to recover that is to begin turning your attention back inward, to begin listening to what you actually feel, to begin treating your own needs with the same care and respect you have always offered to others. This is not a quick process. It is not something you master in a week or a month. It is a gradual unfolding, a slow reclaiming of yourself, a patient rebuilding of trust between you and your own inner guidance. And it requires you to be gentle with yourself, to recognize that you are unlearning patterns that have been in place for a very long time, patterns that once helped you survive but now keep you from truly living. And as you move through this process, you may notice something unexpected. You may notice that as you begin to honor your own needs, as you begin to set boundaries, as you begin to say no when something does not feel right, you do not lose connection. Not with the people who matter. In fact, you may find that connection deepens, because you are finally showing up as yourself, without the performance, without the constant adjusting, without the fear that if you stop accommodating, you will be abandoned. This is the possibility that exists on the other side of people-pleasing. Not a life where you do not care about others, but a life where you also care about yourself. Not a life where you become selfish, but a life where you become whole. Not a life where you reject connection, but a life where you allow real connection, the kind that is built on honesty, on mutual respect, on the understanding that both people in the relationship matter. And this possibility is available to you, not someday in the future when you have it all figured out, but right now, in this moment, in the simple choice to begin noticing. To begin paying attention to what you feel. To begin honoring what you need. To begin treating yourself with the kindness and respect you have always deserved, but perhaps never fully believed you were allowed to claim. Chapter 2: Why Saying Yes Feels Safer Than Being Honest. There is a moment that happens before you say yes. It is brief, almost imperceptible, but it is there. In that moment, something inside you registers what you actually feel. It registers the hesitation, the resistance, the quiet sense that this is not what you want. And then, just as quickly, that feeling is overridden. You say yes anyway. You agree. You accommodate. And the moment passes. This happens so quickly that you may not even notice it. It has become automatic, a reflex that operates below the level of conscious thought. But if you slow down and pay attention, you may begin to see that there is always a choice being made in that moment. It is a choice between honoring what you feel and protecting yourself from something that feels more dangerous than the discomfort of agreeing. And what feels more dangerous, in that moment, is the possibility of being rejected. Rejection is not just an idea. It is not just a concept you think about intellectually. It is something that registers in your body as a threat. And this is not irrational. Human beings are wired for connection. For most of human history, being excluded from the group meant death. It meant losing access to resources, to protection, to the support necessary for survival. And while the world has changed, your nervous system has not. It still responds to the threat of rejection as if it were a threat to your survival. This is why saying no can feel so difficult. It is not just about disappointing someone. It is not just about creating a moment of awkwardness. It is about activating a deep, primal fear that if you are not what others need you to be, you will be cast out. You will be left alone. You will lose the connection that feels essential to your sense of safety in the world. And this fear is not something you consciously choose. It is something that lives in the background of your awareness, shaping your decisions without you realizing it. It is the reason why you may find yourself agreeing to things you do not want to do, even when there is no logical reason to believe that saying no would lead to rejection. The fear is not based on logic. It is based on a much older part of your brain that is simply trying to keep you safe. This fear often has its roots in early experiences. If you grew up in an environment where love felt conditional, or approval had to be earned, or expressing your true feelings led to withdrawal or punishment, then you learned that being yourself was risky. You learned that the way to stay safe, to stay connected, was to be what others needed. And that lesson, once learned, becomes deeply embedded in how you relate to the world. Children do not have the cognitive capacity to understand that their caregivers' reactions are often about the caregiver's own limitations, their own stress, their own unresolved pain. Children simply absorb what happens and try to make sense of it. And the sense they make is often this: if I am rejected, it is because I am not enough. If I am criticized, it is because I did something wrong. If I am ignored, it is because I do not matter. And the solution, the way to fix this, is to become whatever it takes to be accepted. This is not a conscious strategy. It is a survival response. And it works, in the sense that it helps the child navigate an environment that feels unpredictable or unsafe. But it also sets up a pattern that continues long after the original circumstances have changed. The fear of rejection becomes the lens through which you interpret all of your relationships. And the behavior that once helped you survive becomes the thing that prevents you from truly connecting. What makes this particularly challenging is that the fear is often invisible. You may not think of yourself as someone who is afraid of rejection. You may see yourself as someone who is simply kind, or flexible, or easy to get along with. But underneath those qualities, there is often a vigilance, a constant scanning for signs of disapproval, a readiness to adjust yourself in order to keep things smooth. And that vigilance is rooted in fear, even if you do not name it as such. This fear shapes how you interpret other people's responses. If someone seems distant, you may immediately assume you have done something wrong. If someone does not respond to your message right away, you may begin to worry that they are upset with you. If someone disagrees with you, you may interpret it as a sign that you are not acceptable. And in each of these moments, the fear of rejection is activated, and the impulse to fix it, to smooth it over, to make yourself more agreeable, takes over. This is exhausting. It is exhausting to live in a state where your sense of safety depends on constant monitoring and adjustment. It is exhausting to always be ready to change yourself in order to prevent a threat that may not even be real. And over time, this exhaustion becomes a baseline state, something you carry with you without realizing how much energy it consumes. But here is what happens when you begin to see this pattern clearly. You begin to understand that the fear of rejection is not the same as actual rejection. The fear is a signal, a warning system that is trying to protect you. But it is not always accurate. It does not mean that rejection is imminent. It simply means that some part of you has been triggered, some part of you that learned long ago that being yourself was dangerous. And once you see this, you have the opportunity to make a different choice. Not to force yourself to stop feeling the fear, but to recognize it for what it is. To notice when it arises. To understand that it is a response to an old threat, not necessarily a current one. And from that place of awareness, you can begin to ask yourself a different question. Not how can I avoid rejection, but what is actually true for me in this moment? This is not easy. It requires you to slow down, to create space between the fear and your response. It requires you to tolerate the discomfort of not immediately accommodating, not immediately smoothing things over. It requires you to sit with the possibility that someone might be disappointed, or upset, or confused by your honesty. And that possibility can feel unbearable, because it activates the very fear you have been trying to avoid. But here is what you may begin to notice. Often, the thing you fear does not actually happen. Often, when you express what you truly feel, when you set a boundary, when you say no, the other person responds with understanding. Or they respond with disappointment, but the relationship does not end. Or they respond with confusion, but the connection remains intact. And in those moments, you learn something important. You learn that honesty does not always lead to rejection. You learn that you can be yourself and still be loved. This learning does not happen all at once. It happens gradually, through repeated experiences where you take the risk of being honest and discover that the outcome is not as catastrophic as your fear predicted. And each time this happens, the fear loses a little bit of its power. It is still there, but it no longer dictates your choices in the same way. You begin to develop a different relationship with it, one where you can notice it, acknowledge it, and still choose to honor what is true for you. And this is where something important begins to shift. Because when you are no longer driven by the fear of rejection, you have access to a different kind of clarity. You can begin to see that saying yes when you mean no is not actually keeping you safe. It is not actually preserving connection. It is simply delaying the inevitable tension that arises when you are not being honest about what you feel. This tension is what makes saying yes feel safer in the moment. Because saying yes avoids the immediate discomfort of conflict. It avoids the awkwardness of someone being disappointed. It avoids the risk of someone withdrawing or becoming upset. And in that moment, it feels like the right choice. It feels like you are preserving harmony, maintaining the relationship, keeping things comfortable. But what you are actually doing is trading short-term comfort for long-term discomfort. Because the tension does not disappear when you say yes. It simply moves inside you. It becomes something you carry, something you manage quietly, something that accumulates over time. And the more you avoid the external discomfort of honesty, the more you create internal discomfort in the form of resentment, confusion, and a growing sense of disconnection from yourself. This is the trade-off that is rarely acknowledged. Saying yes feels safer because it keeps the conflict outside of you. It keeps the discomfort in the realm of potential rather than actual. But in doing so, it moves the conflict inside you, where it becomes something you have to manage alone, without the possibility of resolution. Because you cannot resolve a conflict that no one else knows exists. And this is where the illusion of peace begins to break down. Because what you are calling peace is not actually peace. It is simply the absence of visible conflict. But underneath that surface calm, there is a great deal happening. There is the tension of suppressing what you feel. There is the effort of managing your own discomfort so that it does not spill out and disrupt the harmony you are trying to maintain. There is the constant vigilance required to keep your true feelings hidden, to keep your needs from becoming visible, to keep the performance going. This is not peace. This is control. And the cost of that control is the loss of your own inner calm. Because when you are constantly managing your feelings, constantly suppressing your needs, constantly adjusting yourself to fit what others expect, you are living in a state of internal tension. And that tension, over time, becomes normalized. It becomes the baseline. You forget what it feels like to simply be, without the constant effort of managing how you are perceived. This is why it is so important to understand the difference between emotional peace and emotional suppression. They can look the same on the surface. They can both result in a calm exterior, in relationships that appear smooth and conflict-free. But they feel very different from the inside. Emotional peace comes from a place of alignment, where what you feel and what you express are in harmony. Emotional suppression comes from a place of disconnection, where what you feel and what you express are at odds, and the gap between them is something you have to constantly manage. And the longer you live in a state of suppression, the harder it becomes to distinguish between the two. You may begin to believe that the absence of conflict means you are at peace. You may begin to think that if no one is upset with you, then everything is fine. But inside, there is a growing sense of unease, a feeling that something is not quite right, even if you cannot name what it is. This unease is your body's way of telling you that the tension is building. It is a signal that something needs to shift. But because you have learned to prioritize external harmony over internal clarity, you may ignore this signal. You may push it down, distract yourself from it, rationalize it away. And the more you do this, the more the tension accumulates. This accumulation is gradual. It does not announce itself. It simply builds, layer by layer, moment by moment, each time you say yes when you mean no, each time you suppress what you feel in order to keep someone else comfortable. And because it happens slowly, you may not notice it until it reaches a point where it can no longer be ignored. Until it shows up as exhaustion that does not go away, or resentment that you cannot explain, or a sense of emptiness that feels like something essential is missing. And when you reach that point, you may find yourself wondering how you got here. You may look back and see that you have spent years accommodating, years adjusting, years making yourself smaller in order to fit into spaces that were never truly yours. And the realization can be painful. Not because you did something wrong, but because you sacrificed something important without fully understanding what you were giving up. This is the hidden cost of prioritizing external peace over internal truth. It is not just that you avoid conflict. It is that you lose touch with yourself. You lose the ability to know what you want, what you need, what feels right for you. And without that knowledge, you cannot navigate toward a life that actually nourishes you. You can only navigate toward a life that keeps others comfortable, and hope that somewhere in that process, you will find a place for yourself. But that place rarely appears. Because when you are always adjusting to fit external expectations, there is no room for you to show up as you are. There is only room for the version of yourself that has been edited, refined, and carefully managed to be acceptable. And that version, while it may be easier for others to be around, is not actually you. It is a performance. And the longer you perform, the further you drift from the person you are underneath the act. And this drift is where the deepest discomfort lies. Not in the occasional tension of saying no, not in the brief awkwardness of setting a boundary, but in the slow, steady loss of yourself. In the gradual erosion of your ability to trust your own feelings, to honor your own needs, to stand firmly in what you know to be true. This is the price of choosing what feels safe over what is honest. And it is a price that is paid quietly, privately, in ways that are often invisible to everyone around you. But it is not invisible to you. You feel it. You feel it in the moments when you agree to something and immediately wish you had not. You feel it in the resentment that surfaces when you are doing something you do not want to do. You feel it in the confusion that arises when you realize you do not know what you actually want, because you have spent so long focusing on what others want from you. You feel it in the exhaustion that comes from constantly managing yourself, constantly performing, constantly trying to be enough. And the difficult part is that this exhaustion does not just affect you. It affects your relationships as well. Because when you are always accommodating, always agreeing, always making yourself smaller, you are not actually giving others the opportunity to know you. You are giving them a version of you that has been carefully curated to avoid conflict, to prevent disappointment, to keep things smooth. And while this may feel like care, it is also a form of distance. Because real intimacy requires honesty. It requires showing up as you are, with your needs and your boundaries and your complexity. And when you withhold that, when you hide behind agreeableness, you are preventing the kind of connection you actually long for. You are preventing the possibility of being truly seen, truly known, truly accepted for who you are rather than for what you do. And this is the paradox. You engage in people pleasing because you fear rejection, but in doing so, you create a situation where true acceptance is impossible. Because what is being accepted is not you. It is the version of you that has been shaped to fit what you believe others need. This is not sustainable. It is not sustainable to live in a constant state of internal tension. It is not sustainable to always be managing your feelings, suppressing your needs, adjusting yourself to fit external expectations. At some point, something has to give. And often, what gives is your sense of self. Your clarity about who you are and what you stand for. Your ability to trust your own feelings and honor your own needs. And when that clarity is lost, it becomes very difficult to navigate the world in a way that feels aligned. You may find yourself in situations that drain you, with people who take more than they give, doing things that do not reflect your values or your desires. And you may not understand how you ended up here, because each individual choice seemed reasonable in the moment. Each yes seemed like the right thing to do. But the cumulative effect is a life that does not feel like yours. This is where the work of recovery begins. Not in forcing yourself to change overnight, not in criticizing yourself for the choices you have made, but in simply beginning to notice. In beginning to see how often you prioritize external comfort over internal truth. In beginning to recognize the moments when you say yes but feel no. In beginning to understand that the fear of rejection, while real, is not the same as actual rejection. And that choosing honesty, while uncomfortable, is not the same as choosing conflict. This noticing is the first step. It is not dramatic. It does not require you to make sweeping changes or declarations. It simply requires you to pay attention. To slow down in those moments when you feel the impulse to agree, to accommodate, to smooth things over. To create space between the impulse and the action. To ask yourself what you actually feel, what you actually need, what is actually true for you in this moment. And in that space, you may begin to see that you have options. You do not have to say yes. You do not have to suppress what you feel. You do not have to prioritize someone else's comfort over your own clarity. You can choose differently. Not because you are trying to be difficult, not because you are rejecting care or connection, but because you are learning to include yourself in your own consideration. Because you are learning that your needs matter, your feelings are valid, and your honesty is not a threat to the relationships that truly value you. This learning takes time. It takes practice. It takes a willingness to tolerate discomfort, to sit with the fear of rejection without immediately acting to prevent it. It takes courage to be honest when dishonesty feels safer. But it is possible. And it begins with the simple recognition that what feels safe in the moment is not always what serves you in the long term. That avoiding conflict externally often creates conflict internally. And that true peace, the kind that is sustainable, the kind that nourishes rather than depletes, comes not from suppressing what you feel, but from honoring it. This is the shift that is available to you. Not a shift that happens all at once, but a gradual reorientation toward yourself. A slow rebuilding of trust between you and your own inner guidance. A patient practice of noticing, of choosing, of honoring what is true even when it feels risky. And as you move through this process, you may begin to discover something unexpected. You may begin to discover that honesty does not destroy connection. It deepens it. That boundaries do not push people away. They create clarity. That saying no does not make you selfish. It makes you real. And in that realness, there is a kind of freedom. A freedom from the constant vigilance, the constant performance, the constant effort of managing how you are perceived. A freedom to simply be, to feel, to express, without the fear that if you are not what others need, you will lose everything. Because you begin to understand that the people who truly value you do not need you to be anything other than yourself. And the people who cannot accept you as you are were never offering the kind of connection you actually need. This understanding does not make the fear disappear. But it does change your relationship with it. It does give you a foundation from which to act, even when the fear is present. And over time, as you practice being honest, as you practice setting boundaries, as you practice saying no when something does not feel right, the fear begins to lose its grip. It is still there, but it no longer controls you. And that is the difference between being driven by fear and simply noticing it as one signal among many. And in that space, you begin to reclaim something essential. Not just your ability to say no, but your ability to know yourself. To trust yourself. To honor yourself. To move through the world with a quiet confidence that comes not from external approval, but from internal alignment. And that alignment is what true peace feels like. Not the absence of conflict, but the presence of clarity. Not the suppression of feeling, but the honoring of truth. Chapter 3: What Boundaries Really Are. When you hear the word boundary, a certain image may come to mind. You may think of walls, of distance, of shutting people out. You may think of rigidity, of coldness, of a line drawn in the sand that says this far and no further. And if this is what you think boundaries are, then it makes sense that setting them would feel uncomfortable, even wrong. Because who wants to be the person who builds walls, who keeps others at a distance, who refuses connection? But this understanding of boundaries is not accurate. It is a distortion, one that makes boundaries seem like something they are not. And this distortion is part of what keeps you trapped in patterns of people-pleasing, because if you believe that boundaries are walls, then setting them feels like an act of rejection. It feels like you are choosing separation over connection. And so you avoid them, you soften them, you let them blur until they are barely there at all. The reality is different. Boundaries are not walls. They are not barriers that keep people out. They are clarifications. They are a way of defining where you end and someone else begins. They are a way of protecting your energy, your time, your emotional space, not because others are a threat, but because you have limits. Because you are human. Because you cannot give endlessly without depleting yourself. And boundaries are simply the way you honor that reality. Think of it this way. A boundary is not a statement about the other person. It is a statement about you. It is not a rejection of them. It is a recognition of your own needs, your own capacity, your own limits. It is a way of saying, this is what I can do. This is what I cannot do. This is what feels right for me. This is what does not. And that clarity is not cruelty. It is honesty. It is respect, both for yourself and for the other person, because it allows them to know where they stand with you rather than having to guess. But if you have spent a long time avoiding boundaries, if you have learned that accommodation is safer than honesty, then this clarity can feel dangerous. It can feel like you are doing something wrong, like you are being selfish, like you are prioritizing yourself in a way that is inappropriate or hurtful. And this is where the confusion arises, because you have been taught, in subtle and not so subtle ways, that your needs are secondary. That caring for others means putting them first, always, without question. And so the idea of setting a boundary, of saying I cannot do this or this does not work for me, feels like a violation of that unspoken rule. This is where it becomes important to understand the difference between a boundary and a wall. A wall is rigid. It is defensive. It is built out of fear, out of a need to protect yourself from hurt or intrusion. A wall says, I will not let you in. I will not be vulnerable. I will not allow connection because connection is dangerous. And walls do serve a purpose. Sometimes, in certain situations, they are necessary. But they are not the same as boundaries. A boundary is flexible. It is not built out of fear, but out of self-respect. It is not about shutting people out, but about defining the terms of engagement. It is a way of saying, I want to connect with you, and in order to do that in a way that is sustainable, I need to honor my limits. I need to protect my energy. I need to ensure that what I am giving comes from a place of genuine care rather than depletion or obligation. This distinction is subtle but important. Because when you set a boundary from a place of clarity rather than defensiveness, the energy is different. The tone is different. The intention is different. You are not pushing someone away. You are simply defining what is possible for you, what is sustainable, what allows you to show up in a way that is authentic rather than exhausted. And this is what people often miss when they think about boundaries. They think that setting a boundary means being harsh, or cold, or unfeeling. But that is not what a boundary is. That is what defensiveness looks like. That is what happens when you have been pushed beyond your limits for so long that the only way to protect yourself is to shut down, to pull back, to create distance. But that is a response to boundary violations, not a boundary itself. A healthy boundary is calm. It is clear. It is stated without anger, without justification, without the need to convince the other person that it is valid. It is simply a statement of what is true for you. And that truth does not require anyone else's approval. It does not require you to explain yourself, to defend your needs, to prove that what you are asking for is reasonable. It simply is. This is where many people struggle. Because if you have learned that your needs are not valid unless they are justified, unless they are explained in a way that makes sense to someone else, then stating a boundary without explanation can feel rude. It can feel abrupt. It can feel like you are withholding something that you owe. But you do not owe anyone an explanation for your boundaries. You do not owe anyone access to your reasoning, your feelings, your internal process. You can offer those things if you choose to, but they are not required in order for your boundary to be legitimate. This is a difficult shift for many people. Because the pattern of people-pleasing often includes a pattern of over-explaining. You may find yourself offering long justifications for why you cannot do something, as if you need to convince the other person that your no is acceptable. You may apologize excessively, as if setting a boundary is something you need to be forgiven for. You may soften your language to the point where the boundary becomes unclear, or it sounds more like a suggestion than a statement, because you are trying to avoid the discomfort of being direct. But this over-explanation often backfires. Because when you explain, when you justify, when you apologize, you are implicitly suggesting that your boundary is negotiable. You are opening the door for the other person to argue, to persuade, to push back. And if they do, you may find yourself in a position where you feel obligated to defend your boundary, to prove that it is valid, to justify why you cannot accommodate what they are asking for. And that puts you right back into the pattern of prioritizing their comfort over your clarity. A clear boundary does not require this. It does not invite negotiation. It is simply a statement. I cannot do that. That does not work for me. I need to step back from this. And then, silence. Not hostile silence, not cold silence, but simply the absence of justification. Because the boundary is not up for debate. It is not something you are asking permission for. It is simply what is true. This can feel uncomfortable at first. It can feel harsh, or abrupt, or like you are being unkind. But that discomfort is often a reflection of how unfamiliar this clarity is, not a sign that you are doing something wrong. You have been conditioned to soften, to explain, to accommodate. And so directness feels foreign. It feels like too much. But it is not too much. It is simply honest. And honesty, when delivered with calm and respect, is not cruelty. The challenge is that when you begin to set boundaries in this way, when you stop over-explaining and start simply stating what is true, you may encounter resistance. You may encounter people who are uncomfortable with your clarity, who push back, who try to convince you to change your mind. And this is where it becomes important to understand that resistance is not the same as rejection. It is not a sign that your boundary is wrong. It is simply a sign that the other person is adjusting to a change in the dynamic. If you have been accommodating for a long time, if you have been the person who always says yes, who always adjusts, who always makes things easier, then the people around you have gotten used to that. They have come to expect it. And when you begin to set boundaries, when you begin to say no, when you begin to prioritize your own needs, it disrupts that expectation. It requires them to adjust. And not everyone will do that gracefully. Some people will respect your boundaries immediately. They will appreciate the clarity. They will adjust their expectations and continue the relationship with a new understanding of what is possible. But others will resist. They will question your boundaries, push against them, try to convince you that you are being unreasonable or selfish. And this resistance can be painful, especially if it comes from people you care about, people whose approval you have been seeking, people whose comfort you have been prioritizing. But here is what is important to understand. Their resistance is not about you. It is about them. It is about their discomfort with the change, their attachment to the way things were, their own difficulty with accepting that you have needs and limits. And while you can be compassionate about that discomfort, you do not have to absorb it. You do not have to change your boundary in order to make them comfortable. Because if you do, you are right back in the pattern of prioritizing their feelings over your own clarity. This is where the guilt often arises. Because when someone reacts negatively to your boundary, when they express disappointment or frustration or confusion, it activates that old fear. The fear that if you are not accommodating, if you are not easy, if you are not what they need, you will lose them. And that fear can be so strong that it overrides everything else. It overrides your own needs, your own limits, your own sense of what is right for you. And so you soften the boundary, or you take it back, or you apologize for it, all in an attempt to restore the comfort, to prevent the loss, to keep the connection intact. But what you are actually doing in that moment is teaching the other person that your boundaries are not real. That they can be negotiated, pushed, ignored. And you are teaching yourself that your needs do not matter as much as their comfort. And that is a painful lesson to reinforce, because it takes you right back to the beginning, to the place where you learned that being yourself is risky, that your feelings are secondary, that the way to stay safe is to accommodate. This is why setting boundaries often brings up guilt. Not because you are doing something wrong, but because you are doing something that conflicts with a deeply ingrained belief about how you should be. You have learned that caring for others means putting them first. You have learned that being kind means being accommodating. You have learned that maintaining relationships means suppressing your own needs. And boundaries challenge all of that. They challenge the idea that your worth is tied to how much you give, how much you accommodate, how much you make things easier for everyone else. And that challenge is uncomfortable. It brings up all the old fears, all the old beliefs, all the conditioning that told you that your needs are selfish, that your limits are unreasonable, that setting boundaries is a form of rejection. But those beliefs are not true. They are simply the voice of the part of you that learned to survive by being small, by being easy, by being whatever others needed. And that part of you, while it was trying to protect you, is also keeping you trapped. The guilt you feel when you set a boundary is not a sign that the boundary is wrong. It is a sign that you are challenging an old pattern. It is a sign that you are beginning to prioritize your own needs, and that feels unfamiliar, even threatening, to the part of you that has been conditioned to believe that your value depends on your willingness to sacrifice yourself for others. But that belief is not serving you. It never was. It was simply a way of coping with circumstances that felt unsafe. And now, as you begin to set boundaries, as you begin to honor your limits, as you begin to treat your needs with the same respect you offer to others, you are creating new circumstances. You are creating a space where you can be honest, where you can be real, where you can be yourself without the constant performance of accommodation. And that space, while it may feel uncomfortable at first, is where true connection becomes possible. Because here is what happens when you set boundaries from a place of clarity. You begin to discover who actually respects you, and who is simply comfortable with your lack of boundaries. You begin to see which relationships are built on mutual respect, and which are built on your willingness to accommodate. You begin to understand that the people who truly value you do not need you to be limitless. They do not need you to always say yes. They do not need you to suppress your needs in order for the relationship to work. And the people who do need that, the people who cannot accept your boundaries, who push back against them, who make you feel guilty for having them, are showing you something important. They are showing you that what they valued was not you, but what you were willing to do. And while that realization can be painful, it is also clarifying. Because it allows you to see the difference between connection and convenience. Between being valued and being used. Between relationships that nourish you and relationships that deplete you. This clarity does not come easily. It requires you to tolerate the discomfort of other people's reactions. It requires you to sit with the guilt without immediately acting to relieve it. It requires you to trust that honoring your needs is not selfish, even when it feels that way. And it requires you to accept that some people may not like your boundaries, may not understand them, may not respect them. And that is okay. Because your boundaries are not about them. They are about you. This is the shift that is necessary. From seeing boundaries as something you do to others, to seeing them as something you do for yourself. From thinking of boundaries as rejection, to understanding them as clarity. From believing that boundaries will destroy your relationships, to recognizing that they will actually strengthen the relationships that are worth keeping, and reveal the ones that were never truly based on mutual respect. And as you begin to practice this, as you begin to set boundaries without over-explaining, without apologizing, without softening them to the point where they are no longer clear, you may notice something unexpected. You may notice that your relationships do not fall apart. You may notice that the people who matter, the people who truly care about you, respond to your boundaries with respect. They may not always like them. They may be disappointed. They may need to adjust their expectations. But they do not reject you. They do not punish you. They do not make you feel guilty for having needs. And the people who do react that way, the people who cannot tolerate your boundaries, are often the people who are benefiting from your lack of them. They were comfortable with the dynamic where you accommodated, where you adjusted, where you made things easy. And when that dynamic changes, when you begin to honor your limits, they are no longer comfortable. And that discomfort is not your responsibility to manage. It is theirs. This is where the practice of boundaries becomes an act of self-respect. Because every time you set a boundary and hold it, even when it feels uncomfortable, even when it brings up guilt, even when someone reacts negatively, you are teaching yourself something important. You are teaching yourself that your needs matter. That your limits are valid. That you are allowed to protect your energy, your time, your emotional space, without needing anyone's permission or approval. And that teaching, that practice, is what begins to shift the foundation of how you relate to yourself and others. Because you are no longer operating from the belief that your worth depends on your willingness to accommodate. You are operating from the belief that your worth is inherent, that your needs are legitimate, that your boundaries are not negotiable. And that belief, once it takes root, changes everything. It changes how you show up in relationships. It changes how you respond to requests. It changes how you interpret other people's reactions. It changes how you feel about yourself. Because you are no longer carrying the weight of everyone else's expectations, everyone else's needs, everyone else's comfort. You are carrying your own clarity, your own sense of what is right for you, your own commitment to honoring your limits. And that is a much lighter load. This does not mean that setting boundaries becomes easy. It does not mean that the guilt disappears, or that everyone responds with understanding, or that you never doubt yourself. But it does mean that you have a foundation to return to. A foundation that says, my needs matter. My limits are valid. My boundaries are not up for negotiation. And that foundation, once established, gives you the strength to navigate the discomfort, to tolerate the resistance, to hold your boundaries even when it feels hard. And over time, as you practice this, as you set boundaries and see that you survive the discomfort, as you notice that your relationships do not crumble, as you experience the relief of living in alignment with your own truth, the practice becomes less effortful. It becomes more natural. It becomes simply the way you relate to the world. Not from a place of defensiveness, not from a place of fear, but from a place of clarity. From a place of self-respect. From a place of understanding that boundaries are not walls. They are simply the way you take care of yourself, the way you honor your limits, the way you create space for connection that is real, that is sustainable, that is based on mutual respect rather than on your willingness to sacrifice yourself for the comfort of others. This is what boundaries really are. They are not rejection. They are not cruelty. They are not walls. They are clarity. They are honesty. They are the way you define what is possible for you, what is sustainable, what allows you to show up as yourself rather than as a performance. And that clarity, while it may feel uncomfortable at first, is the foundation of a life that is truly yours. A life where you are not constantly managing other people's reactions, not constantly suppressing your needs, not constantly adjusting yourself to fit external expectations. a life where you are simply, fully, honestly yourself. And that is not selfish. That is simply what it means to live with integrity. Chapter 4: Rebuilding Self-Respect from the Inside. There is a moment that happens after you set a boundary. The words have been spoken. The clarity has been offered. And then, you wait. You wait to see how the other person will respond. You wait to see if they will be upset, or disappointed, or confused. You wait to see if the fear you have been carrying, the fear that honesty will lead to rejection, will finally come true. And in that waiting, something important is revealed. Because how you feel in that moment, how much anxiety you carry, how much your sense of stability depends on their reaction, tells you something about where your self-respect currently lives. If their response has the power to make you doubt your boundary, to make you question whether you did the right thing, to make you feel guilty or anxious or wrong, then your self-respect is still located outside of you. It is still tied to external validation. It is still dependent on others approving of your choices in order for you to feel okay about them. This is not a judgment. It is simply an observation. And it is a very common place to be, especially if you have spent a long time prioritizing the comfort and approval of others. Because when you have learned that your worth depends on how well you meet external expectations, then other people's reactions become the measure of whether you are acceptable. Their approval becomes the proof that you are doing things right. And their disapproval becomes evidence that you have failed, that you have done something wrong, that you need to adjust in order to restore your value. But this is an exhausting way to live. Because it means that your sense of stability, your sense of worth, your sense of being okay, is constantly shifting based on factors outside of your control. It means that you are always at the mercy of other people's moods, their expectations, their capacity to understand and respect your needs. And when your self-respect is located externally like this, you can never truly rest. You can never fully relax. Because there is always the possibility that someone will withdraw their approval, and when they do, you will lose your sense of being okay. This is what makes the shift from external validation to internal stability so important. Because as long as your self-respect depends on others, you will always be vulnerable. You will always be performing, always adjusting, always managing how you are perceived in order to maintain the approval that feels necessary for your survival. But when your self-respect is rooted internally, when it is based on your own sense of integrity rather than on external feedback, then other people's reactions, while they may still affect you, do not determine your worth. They do not have the power to destabilize you. They are simply information, not a verdict on whether you are acceptable. This shift does not happen overnight. It is not something you can force or manufacture. It is something that develops gradually, through practice, through repeated experiences where you honor your own truth and discover that you can survive the discomfort of others' reactions. It is something that builds over time, as you begin to trust that your worth is not contingent on external approval, that your value is inherent, that you are allowed to have needs and limits and boundaries without needing anyone's permission. And the first step in this shift is simply noticing where your self-respect currently lives. Noticing how much weight you give to other people's opinions. Noticing how much their approval affects your sense of stability. Noticing how much their disapproval shakes your confidence. This noticing is not about criticizing yourself for caring what others think. It is simply about seeing clearly how the dynamic currently operates, so that you can begin to make different choices. Because here is what often happens. When you set a boundary and someone reacts negatively, your immediate impulse may be to fix it. To explain yourself more. To soften the boundary. To apologize. To do something, anything, to restore their comfort and thereby restore your own sense of being okay. And this impulse is understandable. It is the same impulse that has been driving the pattern of people-pleasing all along. It is the impulse to manage external reactions in order to feel safe. But every time you act on that impulse, every time you adjust your boundary in response to someone's discomfort, you are reinforcing the belief that your worth depends on their approval. You are teaching yourself that your needs are only valid if others agree with them. You are strengthening the pattern that keeps your self-respect located outside of you, dependent on factors you cannot control. The alternative is to simply sit with the discomfort. To notice the impulse to fix, to explain, to adjust, and to choose not to act on it. To allow the other person to have their reaction, whatever it is, without making it your responsibility to manage. To trust that your boundary is valid, not because they agree with it, but because it is true for you. And to allow that truth to be enough, even when it feels uncomfortable, even when it brings up fear, even when it activates all the old conditioning that says you are only okay if others are comfortable. This is not easy. It requires you to tolerate a level of discomfort that may feel unbearable at first. Because when you are used to managing other people's reactions, when your sense of safety has been tied to their approval, then allowing them to be upset, or disappointed, or confused, without immediately acting to fix it, can feel like you are doing something dangerous. It can feel like you are risking everything. It can feel like you are about to lose the connection that feels essential to your survival. But here is what you begin to discover as you practice this. Most of the time, the catastrophic outcome you fear does not actually happen. Most of the time, when you hold your boundary and allow the other person to have their reaction, they adjust. They may not like it. They may express disappointment. They may need time to process. But the relationship does not end. The connection does not dissolve. And you do not lose everything. And even in the cases where someone does pull away, where they cannot accept your boundary, where the relationship does change or end, you discover something important. You discover that you survive. You discover that losing someone's approval, while painful, is not the same as losing yourself. You discover that you can tolerate the discomfort of disappointing someone, and that tolerating that discomfort does not destroy you. And each time you survive this, each time you hold your boundary and discover that you are still okay on the other side, something shifts. Your self-respect begins to migrate inward. It begins to root itself not in external approval, but in your own sense of integrity. This is what it means to rebuild self-respect from the inside. It is not about becoming indifferent to others. It is not about no longer caring what people think. It is about developing a foundation that is stable regardless of what others think. It is about learning to trust your own sense of what is right, what is true, what is necessary for your well-being, even when that conflicts with what others want from you. It is about discovering that your worth is not something that can be given or taken away by external validation. It is simply there, inherent, unchanging, regardless of whether others recognize it. And as this foundation begins to develop, as your self-respect becomes less dependent on external approval, something else begins to shift. Your presence changes. Not in a way that is loud or dramatic, but in a way that is quiet and undeniable. You begin to carry yourself differently. You begin to speak with a calm certainty that does not require justification. You begin to hold your boundaries without apology, without over-explanation, without the need to convince anyone that they are valid. And that quiet certainty, that calm presence, has a power that accommodation never did. This is the power of a quiet but clear stance. It is not aggressive. It is not defensive. It is not harsh. It is simply steady. It is the presence of someone who knows what they stand for, who is clear about their limits, who is not asking for permission to have needs. And that steadiness, that clarity, communicates something important. It communicates that you respect yourself. And when you respect yourself, others are more likely to respect you as well. This is not a guarantee. There will always be people who do not respect boundaries, who push against limits, who try to manipulate or guilt or pressure you into accommodating their needs. But when your self-respect is rooted internally, when you are clear about what is acceptable and what is not, those attempts have less power. They do not destabilize you. They do not make you doubt yourself. They are simply information about the other person, not a verdict on your worth. And this is where the difference between quiet strength and defensive hardness becomes clear. Because defensive hardness is a reaction to feeling unsafe. It is a way of protecting yourself by shutting down, by building walls, by refusing connection. It comes from a place of fear, a place of hurt, a place of needing to guard against further harm. And while it may protect you in the short term, it also isolates you. It prevents intimacy. It keeps people at a distance, not because you are setting healthy boundaries, but because you are too wounded to allow anyone close. Quiet strength is different. It does not come from fear. It comes from clarity. It is not a wall built to keep people out. It is a foundation that allows you to stay grounded while remaining open. It is the ability to hold your boundaries without hardening, to protect your energy without shutting down, to honor your needs without becoming rigid or inflexible. It is strength that does not need to prove itself, that does not need to be loud or forceful, that simply is. And this quiet strength is what begins to emerge as you rebuild your self-respect from the inside. Because you are no longer spending energy managing other people's reactions. You are no longer performing, adjusting, accommodating in order to keep the peace. You are simply being clear about what is true for you, and allowing that clarity to guide your choices. And that clarity, that groundedness, that refusal to abandon yourself in order to keep others comfortable, creates a presence that is both calm and powerful. This presence is not something you can manufacture. It is not something you can fake. It is simply the natural result of living in alignment with your own truth. Of honoring your needs. Of respecting your limits. Of choosing integrity over approval. And as this presence develops, as it becomes more consistent, more stable, more rooted, it begins to change how others relate to you. Because people respond to presence. They respond to clarity. They respond to the subtle signals that communicate whether you respect yourself or not. And when you respect yourself, when you are clear about your boundaries, when you are not seeking validation or approval, others pick up on that. They may not always like it. They may not always agree with your choices. But they recognize that you are someone who knows their own mind, who is clear about their limits, who is not going to adjust themselves endlessly in order to accommodate. And this recognition, while it may not always lead to approval, often leads to respect. Because respect is not about agreeing with someone. It is about recognizing that they have a right to their own needs, their own choices, their own boundaries. And when you demonstrate, through your actions, that you respect yourself, you are teaching others how to relate to you. You are showing them that you are not available for relationships that require you to abandon yourself. That you are not interested in connection that is based on your willingness to accommodate at the expense of your own well-being. This teaching happens not through words, but through consistency. Through the repeated choice to honor your boundaries, even when it is uncomfortable. Through the practice of staying grounded in your own truth, even when others push back. Through the willingness to allow others to be disappointed, upset, or confused, without making it your responsibility to fix. And that consistency, over time, creates a new baseline in your relationships. It communicates that your boundaries are not negotiable, that your needs are not optional, that your limits are real. And this is where consistency becomes so important. Because if you set a boundary one day and then soften it the next, if you say no but then change your mind when someone pushes back, if you establish a limit but then allow it to be crossed without consequence, you are sending mixed signals. You are communicating that your boundaries are not real, that they can be negotiated, that if someone is persistent enough, you will eventually give in. And that inconsistency undermines your self-respect and invites others to disrespect your boundaries. Consistency does not mean rigidity. It does not mean you can never change your mind, or reconsider a decision, or adjust a boundary when circumstances change. But it does mean that when you set a boundary, you hold it. When you say no, you mean no. When you establish a limit, you do not allow it to be casually disregarded. Because every time you hold a boundary, every time you follow through on what you said, every time you demonstrate that your words have weight, you are building trust. Not just with others, but with yourself. And this self-trust is the foundation of self-respect. Because if you cannot trust yourself to honor your own boundaries, if you cannot rely on yourself to protect your own needs, then your sense of self-respect will always be fragile. It will always be at risk of collapsing the moment someone challenges you, the moment someone expresses disappointment, the moment someone makes you feel guilty for having needs. But when you consistently honor your boundaries, when you demonstrate through your actions that your limits are real, that your needs matter, that you will not abandon yourself for the comfort of others, you build a foundation of self-trust that cannot be easily shaken. This foundation is what allows you to navigate conflict without losing yourself. It is what allows you to tolerate other people's disappointment without immediately trying to fix it. It is what allows you to hold your ground even when you are being pressured, guilt, or manipulated. Because you know, deep in your bones, that your worth is not dependent on their approval. You know that your boundaries are valid regardless of whether they agree. You know that you can survive their discomfort, their disappointment, their withdrawal, and still be okay. And this knowing is not something you can think your way into. It is not something you can affirm or visualize or convince yourself of through positive thinking. It is something that develops through experience, through the repeated practice of honoring your truth and discovering that you survive. Through the accumulation of moments where you set a boundary and it was uncomfortable but you held it anyway. Where you said no and someone was upset but the relationship did not end. Where you prioritized your needs and felt guilty but did not let that guilt override your clarity. Each of these moments is a small deposit into your foundation of self-respect. Each time you choose integrity over approval, you are strengthening that foundation. Each time you honor your limits despite the discomfort, you are teaching yourself that your worth is not contingent on external validation. And over time, these deposits accumulate. They build. They create a stability that allows you to move through the world with a quiet confidence that does not need to prove itself, that does not need to be loud, that simply knows its own value. This confidence is different from the confidence that comes from achievement, or from being praised, or from meeting external standards. That kind of confidence is fragile because it depends on things outside your control. It rises when you succeed and falls when you fail. It strengthens when you are validated and weakens when you are criticized. It is always contingent, always at risk, always requiring you to perform in order to maintain it. But the confidence that comes from self-respect is different. It is stable. It does not rise and fall based on external feedback. It is not dependent on achievement or validation. It is simply the quiet knowing that you are okay, that your worth is inherent, that you have the right to take up space, to have needs, to set boundaries, to prioritize your well-being, not because you have earned it through accomplishment, but simply because you exist. And this knowing, once it takes root, changes how you show up in every area of your life. It changes how you respond to requests. It changes how you navigate conflict. It changes how you interpret criticism. It changes how you make decisions. It changes how you relate to yourself and to others. Because you are no longer operating from a place of fear, from a place of needing to prove your worth, from a place of seeking validation. You are operating from a place of clarity, of self-trust, of understanding that you are allowed to honor your truth even when it conflicts with what others want from you. This shift is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It simply unfolds gradually, quietly, through the accumulation of small choices that prioritize integrity over approval. Through the practice of noticing when you are about to abandon yourself for the comfort of others, and choosing differently. Through the willingness to sit with the discomfort of setting boundaries, of saying no, of allowing others to be disappointed, without immediately acting to fix it. And as this shift unfolds, as your self-respect becomes more rooted internally, you may notice that the people in your life begin to respond differently. Not everyone. But some. The people who genuinely care about you, who value you as a person rather than for what you do, will respect your boundaries. They will appreciate your honesty. They will value the realness that comes from you no longer performing. And the relationships with these people will deepen, because they are now based on mutual respect rather than on your willingness to accommodate. And the people who do not respond this way, the people who resist your boundaries, who make you feel guilty for having needs, who cannot accept that you have limits, will reveal themselves. And while this can be painful, it is also clarifying. Because it shows you where real connection exists and where it does not. It shows you which relationships are worth investing in and which are draining your energy without offering genuine care in return. This clarity is one of the gifts of rebuilding self-respect from the inside. Because when you are no longer willing to abandon yourself for external approval, when you are no longer performing to maintain connection, you begin to see your relationships more clearly. You begin to see what is real and what is not. You begin to see who respects you and who simply benefited from your lack of boundaries. And that seeing, while it can be uncomfortable, is also liberating. Because it allows you to make conscious choices about where you invest your energy, rather than simply giving it away to anyone who asks. And as you make these choices, as you begin to prioritize relationships that honor your boundaries and distance yourself from those that do not, something else shifts. Your energy returns. The exhaustion that came from constantly managing other people's reactions, from always performing, from never quite feeling like you could relax, begins to lift. Not all at once, but gradually. You find that you have more capacity, more clarity, more peace. Not because your life has become easier, but because you are no longer carrying the weight of everyone else's expectations. This is what it feels like to live with self-respect. Not a life without challenges, not a life without discomfort, but a life where you are grounded in your own truth. Where you are clear about your limits. Where you are willing to honor your needs even when it is uncomfortable. Where you trust yourself to protect your own well-being rather than waiting for others to validate that you deserve it. And this trust, this self-respect, this quiet certainty about your own worth, is not something anyone can give you. It is not something you can receive from external validation, no matter how much praise or approval you accumulate. It is something you build, slowly and steadily, through the repeated choice to honor yourself. Through the practice of setting boundaries and holding them. Through the willingness to tolerate discomfort rather than abandoning your truth. Through the understanding that your worth is inherent, unchanging, independent of whether others recognize it or not. This is the foundation. This is what allows you to move through the world with integrity. This is what makes it possible to have relationships that are real, that are deep, that are based on mutual respect rather than on performance. This is what gives you the strength to say no, to set limits, to protect your energy, without guilt, without apology, without the need to justify your existence. And it begins with the simple choice to stop locating your worth in other people's reactions. To stop giving their approval the power to determine whether you are okay. To stop abandoning yourself in the hope that if you are accommodating enough, flexible enough, easy enough, you will finally feel secure. Because that security never comes from external sources. It only comes from within. From the quiet, steady practice of respecting yourself, honoring your truth, and trusting that you are enough, exactly as you are, regardless of what anyone else thinks. Chapter 5: Calm Assertiveness in Daily Life. There is a quality to calm assertiveness that is difficult to describe but unmistakable when you encounter it. It is not loud. It is not forceful. It does not announce itself or demand attention. But it is there, steady and clear, like a line drawn not in anger but in simple recognition of what is true. And when you speak from this place, when you express a boundary or a need from this centered calm, the energy is entirely different from what happens when you speak from defensiveness, from anger, from the accumulated pressure of too much suppressed feeling. This difference is important to understand. Because many people, when they first begin to set boundaries, when they first begin to say no after years of saying yes, swing too far in the other direction. They become harsh. They become rigid. They confuse assertiveness with aggression, clarity with coldness. And this is understandable. When you have been suppressing your needs for a long time, when you have been accommodating endlessly, the buildup of resentment can be significant. And when you finally decide to stop, when you finally commit to honoring your limits, all of that accumulated feeling can come rushing to the surface. It can make your boundaries sound sharper than you intend. It can make your tone harder than it needs to be. But this hardness, while it may feel powerful in the moment, is not the same as calm assertiveness. It is a reaction. It is the pendulum swinging from one extreme to the other, from endless accommodation to defensive rigidity. And while it may protect you in the short term, it also creates distance. It communicates not just that you have boundaries, but that you are angry, that you are hurt, that you are done. And that energy, while it may get people to back off, does not invite respect. It invites caution. It makes people wary of you, not because they respect your limits, but because they are unsure how you will react. Calm assertiveness is different. It does not carry that edge of anger or defensiveness. It is simply clear. It is the ability to state what is true for you without needing to justify it, without needing to soften it, without needing to make it more palatable. But it is also delivered without hostility, without the undertone of resentment, without the accumulated weight of all the times you said yes when you meant no. It is clean. It is direct. And because it is not reactive, because it is not coming from a place of suppressed frustration, it has a different quality. It invites understanding rather than defensiveness. It communicates strength rather than aggression. This quality is something you develop over time. It is not something you can force or manufacture. It is the natural result of setting boundaries before the resentment builds, of honoring your limits before you are pushed past them, of expressing your needs clearly rather than allowing them to accumulate until they explode. And this is why the practice of noticing, the practice of paying attention to what you feel in the moment rather than waiting until you can no longer tolerate it, is so important. Because when you catch things early, when you address them before they become urgent, you have access to a different kind of energy. You have access to calm, to clarity, to the ability to speak from a centered place rather than from the sharp edge of exhaustion. And when you speak from this place, the words themselves can be simple. You do not need elaborate explanations. You do not need to justify or defend. You simply state what is true. I cannot do that. That does not work for me. I need to step back from this. The sentences are short. The tone is neutral. There is no apology, no justification, no attempt to make the other person feel better about your boundary. There is simply the statement itself, delivered with the quiet confidence that comes from knowing it is true. This simplicity can feel uncomfortable at first, especially if you are used to over-explaining, to offering long justifications for why you cannot do something, to softening your boundaries with apologies and caveats. The directness of calm assertiveness can feel harsh to you, even when it is not. Because you are used to cushioning everything, to making yourself smaller, to ensuring that your needs are expressed in the least intrusive way possible. And so when you strip away all of that cushioning, when you simply state what is true without all the extra layers, it can feel too much. Too blunt. Too cold. But this is often just unfamiliarity. It is the discomfort of doing something different, of speaking in a way that does not prioritize the other person's comfort over your own clarity. And that discomfort is not a sign that you are doing something wrong. It is simply a sign that you are breaking an old pattern, one that required you to always soften, always explain, always make your boundaries as easy to digest as possible. And breaking that pattern feels strange. It feels risky. But it is also necessary if you want to move from people-pleasing to genuine self-respect. And here is what you begin to discover as you practice this. Most people respond better to calm directness than they do to over-explained, apologetic boundaries. Because when you are direct, when you are clear, there is no ambiguity. There is no room for misinterpretation. There is no invitation to negotiate or push back. The boundary is simply stated, and the other person knows exactly where they stand. And while they may not always like it, while they may be disappointed or surprised, they know. They have the information they need. And that clarity, even when it is uncomfortable, is often easier to work with than the confusion that comes from boundaries that are hedged with so many qualifications that they become unclear. This is one of the ways that calm assertiveness actually makes relationships simpler. Because when you are clear, when you are direct, when you say what you mean without all the extra cushioning, you eliminate a lot of the guesswork. You eliminate the dynamic where the other person has to try to figure out what you really mean, what you actually want, whether your yes really means yes or whether it is a reluctant agreement that you will later resent. And that elimination of guesswork creates a different kind of trust. It creates the understanding that when you say something, you mean it. That your words have weight. That you are not performing or accommodating or saying what you think they want to hear. And this trust, this reliability, is something that deepens relationships rather than damaging them. Because the people who care about you, the people who value genuine connection, appreciate knowing where they stand with you. They appreciate not having to guess. They appreciate the honesty, even when it is not what they want to hear. Because it allows them to trust that when you say yes, you actually mean yes. That when you agree to something, you are doing so freely rather than out of obligation or fear of disappointing them. And that knowledge, that trust, creates a foundation for real intimacy. But in order to access this calm assertiveness, in order to speak from this centered place, you have to develop the ability to pause. To create space between the request and your response. To resist the automatic impulse to say yes, to agree, to accommodate. And this pausing, this creating of space, is a skill that requires practice. Because the impulse to respond immediately, to smooth things over, to keep things flowing without tension, is deeply ingrained. It is part of the pattern that has been operating for a long time. And interrupting that pattern requires you to slow down, to notice what you actually feel, to give yourself time to check in with your own truth before responding. This pause does not need to be long. It can be just a few seconds. Just enough time to notice the impulse, to feel what you actually feel, to check whether the yes that is forming on your lips is genuine or automatic. And in that pause, you have the opportunity to make a different choice. Not a forced choice, not a choice that requires you to override your feelings, but a choice that is aligned with your truth. A choice that honors what you actually feel rather than what you think you should feel. And sometimes, in that pause, you may discover that you actually do want to say yes. That the request aligns with what you want, with what you have capacity for, with what feels right. And when that is the case, when the yes is genuine, then there is no problem. You can agree freely, without resentment, without the sense that you are abandoning yourself. But other times, in that pause, you may discover that the yes you were about to give was automatic. That it was not aligned with what you actually feel. That it was driven by the old pattern of accommodation, by the fear of disappointing someone, by the impulse to keep things smooth. And when you discover this, when you notice that the yes is not genuine, then you have the opportunity to respond differently. To say no. To express a boundary. To honor what is actually true for you rather than what you think the other person wants to hear. And this is where calm assertiveness lives. In that space between the request and your response. In the pause that allows you to check in with yourself. In the choice to honor your truth rather than defaulting to accommodation. But pausing is only one part of calm assertiveness. The other part, equally important, is the ability to not react. To receive someone's disappointment, their frustration, their confusion, without immediately moving to fix it. Without defending yourself, without over-explaining, without trying to make them feel better about your boundary. This non-reactivity is not coldness. It is not indifference. It is simply the ability to let the other person have their feelings without making those feelings your responsibility. This is difficult. Especially if you have spent a long time taking responsibility for how others feel, if you have learned that their discomfort is something you need to manage, if you have been conditioned to believe that their emotions are your fault. Because when someone reacts negatively to your boundary, when they express disappointment or upset, every fiber of your being may want to jump in and fix it. To explain more. To soften the boundary. To apologize. To do something, anything, to restore their comfort and thereby restore your own sense of safety. But this impulse, while understandable, is part of the old pattern. It is the pattern that keeps you trapped in people-pleasing, that keeps you abandoning yourself for the comfort of others, that keeps you from ever truly resting in your own truth. And interrupting this impulse, learning to sit with someone's discomfort without reacting to it, is one of the most important skills you can develop in the process of reclaiming your self-respect. This does not mean you become cold or dismissive. It does not mean you ignore their feelings or refuse to acknowledge their disappointment. You can be compassionate. You can be understanding. You can acknowledge that your boundary creates inconvenience or disappointment for them. But you do not take it back. You do not soften it. You do not make it your responsibility to fix their discomfort. You simply hold the boundary, calmly and clearly, and allow them to have their reaction. And this holding, this non-reactivity, communicates something important. It communicates that your boundary is real. That it is not negotiable. That their disappointment, while you may be sorry it exists, does not change what is true for you. And that communication, delivered with calm rather than defensiveness, with clarity rather than apology, is what allows boundaries to function as they are meant to. Not as walls, not as rejections, but as clear definitions of what is possible, what is sustainable, what allows you to show up in a way that is authentic rather than depleted. This non-reactivity also protects you from the manipulation that can sometimes occur when you set boundaries. Because some people, when they encounter a boundary they do not like, will escalate their reaction. They will become more upset, more disappointed, more frustrated, in the hope that their escalation will cause you to back down. And if you are reactive, if you cannot tolerate their discomfort, if you immediately move to fix it when they become upset, then you are teaching them that escalation works. That if they push hard enough, if they express enough disappointment, you will eventually give in. But when you can remain calm, when you can hold your boundary even in the face of escalation, when you can allow them to have their feelings without making those feelings dictate your choices, then the escalation loses its power. It does not work. And over time, when people realize that escalation does not change your boundaries, they stop escalating. They adjust. They learn that you mean what you say, that your boundaries are real, that pushing back does not lead to accommodation. This is not about being cold or rigid. It is about being steady. It is about having a center that does not shift based on external pressure. And that steadiness, that calm in the face of someone else's upset, is what allows you to navigate conflict without losing yourself. Because conflict, when it arises, does not destabilize you. It does not send you into a panic where you immediately try to smooth things over, to fix things, to restore harmony at any cost. You can simply be present with it, allow it to exist, and trust that the discomfort will pass, that the relationship will adjust, and that you do not need to abandon your truth in order to make that happen. This ability to remain calm, to not react, to hold your center even when someone else is upset, is what creates the space for genuine resolution. Because when you are not reactive, when you are not defending or over-explaining or trying to fix, you create room for the other person to process their feelings, to adjust to the new reality, to come to terms with the fact that your boundary is real. And in that space, in that absence of reactivity, real communication becomes possible. Not the kind of communication where one person is trying to convince the other, but the kind where both people can simply be honest about what they feel, what they need, what is possible. And this is where the difference between firmness and harshness becomes especially clear. Because firmness is simply clarity. It is the ability to hold a boundary without wavering, to state what is true without apology, to remain steady even when someone pushes back. But it is delivered with calm. With respect. With the understanding that the other person has a right to their feelings, even if those feelings do not change your boundary. Harshness, on the other hand, is reactivity. It is the sharp edge of frustration, the accumulated resentment, the defensiveness that comes from feeling attacked or pressured. And that harshness, while it may create distance, does not create respect. It creates hurt. It creates more conflict. It escalates rather than resolves. Calm assertiveness avoids this. It navigates the space between accommodation and aggression. It holds the boundary without the harshness, without the edge, without the reactivity. And this navigation, this ability to be both clear and kind, both firm and calm, is what allows relationships to remain intact even when boundaries are set. Because the boundary is not delivered as an attack. It is not delivered as a judgment. It is simply delivered as information. As a statement of what is true. And that statement, when delivered with calm rather than anger, with clarity rather than defensiveness, is much easier for the other person to receive. This is not to say that they will always like it. They may not. They may be disappointed, frustrated, confused. But the way the boundary is delivered affects how they process those feelings. If it is delivered with harshness, with reactivity, with the accumulated weight of all your unspoken resentment, they are more likely to become defensive. To push back. To feel attacked. But if it is delivered with calm, with simplicity, with the quiet confidence that comes from knowing your boundary is valid, they are more likely to accept it. To adjust. To understand that this is simply what is true for you, not a judgment on them. And over time, as you practice this calm assertiveness, as you develop the ability to set boundaries without reactivity, without over-explanation, without the need to justify or defend, something shifts in your relationships. The people who respect you continue to do so. The people who were benefiting from your lack of boundaries either adjust or drift away. And the overall dynamic becomes simpler, cleaner, more honest. Because there is less guessing, less ambiguity, less of the tension that comes from unspoken needs and unexpressed limits. This simplification is one of the most unexpected benefits of setting boundaries. Because many people fear that boundaries will complicate their relationships, will create conflict, will make things harder. But the opposite is often true. Boundaries, when set clearly and consistently, actually simplify relationships. They eliminate the confusion that comes from not knowing where you stand. They eliminate the resentment that builds when you are constantly accommodating. They eliminate the performance that is required when you are always adjusting yourself to fit external expectations. And in that simplification, there is a kind of relief. A relief from the constant vigilance, the constant management, the constant effort of trying to keep everyone comfortable. Because when your boundaries are clear, when people know what to expect from you, when they understand what is possible and what is not, there is less need for all of that management. There is less need to constantly monitor how you are being perceived, to adjust in real time, to smooth over every potential source of tension. You can simply be. You can simply show up as yourself, with your limits and your needs, and trust that the people who value you will work with that rather than against it. This trust is what makes calm assertiveness sustainable. Because if you are constantly fighting to maintain your boundaries, constantly defending them against pushback, constantly having to re-establish them because they are not being respected, then the effort becomes exhausting. It becomes another form of constant vigilance, just in a different direction. But when your boundaries are delivered with calm clarity, when they are held consistently, when they are communicated in a way that is firm but not harsh, they begin to be integrated into your relationships. They become part of the baseline understanding of how you relate. And that integration reduces the effort required to maintain them. This is what it means for boundaries to simplify relationships in the long term. Not that they eliminate all conflict, not that they make everything easy, but that they create a foundation of clarity that reduces the ongoing friction. Because when people know what to expect from you, when they understand your limits, when they trust that you mean what you say, there is less confusion. Less testing. Less of the dynamic where they push to see if you really mean it, where they try to find the edge of your boundary, where they see if you will give in if they push hard enough. And this clarity, this simplification, benefits everyone involved. Not just you, but the people you are in relationship with. Because they no longer have to guess what you want. They no longer have to worry that your yes is actually a reluctant no. They no longer have to navigate the confusion of your unstated resentment, your passive signals of discomfort, your indirect ways of expressing that something is not working. They can simply trust your words. Trust that when you say yes, you mean it. Trust that when you say no, you mean that too. And that trust creates a different kind of relationship, one where both people can be honest, where both people can have needs, where both people are allowed to have limits. This mutuality is what calm assertiveness makes possible. Because when you stop abandoning yourself, when you stop accommodating endlessly, when you start honoring your own needs with the same care you offer to others, you create space for the other person to do the same. You model what it looks like to have boundaries, to express needs, to be honest about limits. And that modeling, that demonstration that it is possible to be both caring and boundaried, often gives others permission to do the same. It creates a relationship where honesty is valued, where directness is appreciated, where both people can show up as they are rather than as who they think they need to be. And this is where calm assertiveness becomes not just a personal practice, but a relational one. Because it is not just about you setting boundaries. It is about creating a dynamic where boundaries are normal, where they are expected, where they are seen as a sign of respect rather than rejection. And that dynamic, once established, changes everything. It changes how conflicts are navigated. It changes how needs are expressed. It changes how disappointments are handled. Because there is a foundation of honesty, of clarity, of mutual respect for each person's limits. This foundation does not develop overnight. It develops through consistency, through the repeated practice of setting boundaries calmly, holding them firmly, and not reacting to the discomfort that arises. It develops through the willingness to tolerate the initial adjustment period, where people are learning that you are no longer available for the old dynamic, where they are discovering that your boundaries are real. And it develops through the patience to allow relationships to either deepen into this new honesty or to naturally fade if they cannot adjust. And as this foundation develops, as your relationships begin to reflect this new baseline of clarity and respect, you may notice something unexpected. You may notice that you have more energy. That the exhaustion that came from constantly managing, constantly accommodating, constantly performing, begins to lift. Not because your life has become easier, not because you have fewer responsibilities, but because you are no longer carrying the weight of everyone else's expectations. You are no longer spending energy trying to be what others need while suppressing what you need. You are simply being yourself, with your boundaries and your limits, and allowing that to be enough. This shift in energy is significant. Because when you are not exhausted, when you are not depleted, when you are not constantly giving from an empty place, you have more capacity for genuine connection. You have more to offer, not because you are forcing yourself to give more, but because you are giving from a place of fullness rather than depletion. And that changes the quality of what you offer. It makes your care more genuine, your presence more real, your connection more sustainable. And this is the paradox that many people discover as they move from people-pleasing to calm assertiveness. They fear that setting boundaries will make them less caring, less generous, less connected. But the opposite is often true. Setting boundaries makes it possible to care in a way that is sustainable. To be generous without depleting yourself. To connect in a way that is real rather than performed. Because you are no longer giving out of obligation, out of fear, out of the need to maintain approval. You are giving because you choose to, because you want to, because it aligns with what you actually feel rather than what you think you should feel. And that freedom, that ability to give freely rather than out of obligation, transforms your relationships. It transforms how you show up. It transforms what you have to offer. Because you are no longer coming from a place of scarcity, from a place of needing to prove your worth, from a place of fearing that if you do not accommodate you will lose everything. You are coming from a place of sufficiency, from a place of self-respect, from a place of understanding that your worth is inherent and your boundaries are valid. This is what calm assertiveness creates. Not a life without conflict, not a life without discomfort, but a life where you can navigate those things without losing yourself. Where you can set boundaries without harshness, hold them without reactivity, and trust that the relationships worth keeping will adjust. Where you can be both kind and clear, both caring and boundaried, both connected and grounded in your own truth. And this balance, this ability to be firm without being harsh, to be clear without being cold, to be assertive without being aggressive, is what allows you to move through daily life with a quiet confidence. A confidence that does not need to prove itself, that does not need to be loud, that simply knows its own value and is willing to honor it. And that confidence, once established, becomes the foundation from which everything else flows. From which relationships deepen. From which clarity emerges. From which genuine connection becomes possible. Not connection based on performance, but connection based on honesty. Not connection that requires you to abandon yourself, but connection that allows you to be fully, authentically, unapologetically yourself. There is a particular moment that happens in the practice of calm assertiveness, a moment that is easy to miss if you are not paying attention. It is the moment when you realize that you no longer feel the need to rehearse what you are going to say. You no longer run through different versions of your boundary in your mind, trying to find the one that will be most acceptable, most palatable, least likely to cause upset. You simply know what is true for you, and when the time comes to express it, the words are there. Simple. Clear. Unadorned. This shift is subtle but significant. Because the need to rehearse, the need to carefully construct your response, is often a sign that you are still trying to control how the other person will react. You are still trying to find the perfect way to say it, the way that will somehow make your boundary easy for them to accept, the way that will prevent disappointment or upset or withdrawal. And that search for the perfect phrasing is exhausting. It keeps you in your head, analyzing and adjusting, trying to predict and prevent every possible negative reaction. But calm assertiveness does not require this. It does not require you to manage the outcome. It simply requires you to state what is true. And when you are grounded in that truth, when you have done the work of separating your worth from others' reactions, when you trust that your boundary is valid regardless of how it is received, then the words become easy. They become natural. They flow not from a place of careful construction, but from a place of simple honesty. This naturalness is what makes calm assertiveness sustainable. Because if you have to carefully construct every boundary, if you have to analyze every response, if you have to constantly manage how you express your needs, then the practice becomes another form of exhaustion. It becomes another thing you have to get right, another performance you have to maintain. But when it becomes natural, when it simply flows from your internal clarity, then it requires less effort. It becomes integrated into how you move through the world, rather than something you have to consciously activate every time. And this integration is what allows calm assertiveness to become a way of being rather than a technique you employ. Because techniques require conscious effort. They require you to remember the steps, to implement the strategy, to perform the behavior. But a way of being is different. It is simply who you are. It is how you naturally respond when you are grounded in your own truth, when you are clear about your limits, when you trust that your needs are valid. This shift from technique to way of being happens gradually. It happens through the accumulation of experiences where you set a boundary and discover that you survive the discomfort. Where you say no and the relationship does not end. Where you express a need and it is met with respect rather than rejection. And each of these experiences builds on the previous one, creating a foundation of trust. Trust in yourself. Trust in your right to have boundaries. Trust that honoring your needs is not selfish or wrong, but simply necessary. And as this trust deepens, as it becomes more rooted, you may notice that the anxiety that used to accompany boundary setting begins to diminish. Not entirely. There may still be moments of discomfort, still situations where setting a boundary feels risky. But the baseline anxiety, the constant worry about how people will respond, the fear that any boundary will lead to catastrophic rejection, begins to quiet. Because you have evidence now. Evidence that boundaries do not destroy relationships. Evidence that honesty, while sometimes uncomfortable, is ultimately more sustainable than accommodation. Evidence that you can tolerate other people's disappointment without collapsing. This evidence is important. Because the fear that kept you trapped in people-pleasing was not based on evidence. It was based on a very old belief, a belief formed in childhood when you did not have the resources to distinguish between temporary discomfort and actual danger. But now, as an adult, you have the capacity to gather new evidence. To test the old belief against current reality. To discover that what you feared would happen often does not happen. And when it does happen, when someone does pull away because you set a boundary, you discover that you survive that too. That losing someone who cannot respect your limits is not the catastrophe your nervous system predicted it would be. And this discovery, this realization that you can survive disappointment, conflict, even loss, without being destroyed, is profoundly liberating. Because it means you are no longer held hostage by the fear of other people's reactions. You are no longer making decisions based on what will keep others comfortable at the expense of your own clarity. You can simply ask yourself what is true, what is right for you, what allows you to show up in a way that is aligned with your values, and then act from that place. Not perfectly. Not without discomfort. But with a foundation of self-trust that was not there before. This self-trust is what allows you to remain calm even when others are not calm. To remain clear even when others are confused. To remain grounded even when others are pushing back. Because you are no longer looking to their reaction to tell you whether your boundary is valid. You already know it is valid. You already know it is necessary. And their reaction, whatever it is simply information about them, not a verdict on you. This shift in perspective changes everything. Because when someone reacts negatively to your boundary, when they express disappointment or frustration or anger, you can receive that information without immediately internalizing it. You can understand that they are having feelings about the situation, and those feelings are theirs to process. You do not need to fix them. You do not need to take them on. You do not need to change your boundary in order to make their feelings go away. You can simply acknowledge that they are upset, express compassion if that feels genuine, and still hold your ground. This holding of ground, this ability to remain steady in the face of someone else's emotional response, is perhaps the most challenging aspect of calm assertiveness. Because it requires you to tolerate something that may feel unbearable. It requires you to sit with someone's unhappiness without immediately moving to resolve it. It requires you to resist the deeply ingrained impulse to fix, to smooth over, to restore harmony at any cost. And that impulse is strong. It has been operating for a long time. It is wired into your nervous system as a survival response. And overriding it, choosing to remain still instead of immediately accommodating, can feel like you are going against every instinct you have. But this is where the practice deepens. Because every time you resist that impulse, every time you choose to remain grounded instead of immediately accommodating, you are rewiring that response. You are teaching your nervous system that staying present with discomfort is safe. That you do not need to fix everything in order to be okay. That other people can have their feelings without those feelings destroying you. And over time, with repetition, this new response becomes stronger. It becomes more accessible. It becomes something you can rely on even in moments of high stress or emotional intensity. And as this capacity develops, as you become more able to remain calm in the face of others' upset, you may notice something unexpected. You may notice that conflicts resolve more quickly. Not because you are trying to resolve them, not because you are working harder to fix things, but because you are not escalating them with your own reactivity. When you can remain calm, when you can hold your boundary without defensiveness or over-explanation, there is less fuel for the conflict. There is nothing for the other person's upset to hook into. And in that absence of escalation, in that space of calm clarity, the intensity often dissipates naturally. This is not always the case. There are situations where the other person will remain upset regardless of how calmly you hold your boundary. There are people who will continue to push, to pressure, to try to wear you down. And in those situations, calm assertiveness means recognizing when further engagement is not productive. It means recognizing when the kindest thing you can do, both for yourself and for them, is to disengage. Not with anger, not with drama, but simply with clarity. I have said what I need to say. I understand you are upset. But my boundary remains. This disengagement, when necessary, is an act of respect. Respect for yourself, for your limits, for your need to protect your energy. And respect for them, for their right to have their feelings without you trying to manage or fix them. Because continuing to engage when a boundary has been clearly stated, when there is nothing more productive to say, often leads to escalation. It leads to circular conversations where the same points are repeated, where frustration builds, where the focus shifts from the actual issue to the emotional intensity of the interaction. Calm assertiveness recognizes when this is happening. And it has the courage to step back. To create space. To allow both people to process separately rather than continuing to engage in a dynamic that is not serving anyone. This stepping back is not abandonment. It is not punishment. It is simply the recognition that sometimes, the most respectful thing you can do is to stop talking and allow the dust to settle. And in that settling, in that space of non-engagement, something important often happens. The other person has the opportunity to process their reaction without the pressure of immediate interaction. They have the chance to move from the initial emotional response to a place of greater clarity. And you have the opportunity to remain grounded in your truth without being pulled into defending or justifying or over-explaining. And often, when both people have had that space, when the immediate intensity has passed, communication becomes possible again. Not the kind of communication where one person is trying to convince the other, but the kind where both people can speak from a calmer place, can hear each other more clearly, can find a way forward that respects both people's needs. This is the rhythm of healthy conflict resolution. Not immediate resolution, not the absence of upset, but the ability to remain grounded, to disengage when necessary, and to return to communication when both people have the capacity for it. And calm assertiveness is what makes this rhythm possible. Because it gives you the ability to set boundaries without escalation, to hold them without rigidity, and to trust that the discomfort of conflict is temporary, that it will pass, and that you do not need to abandon yourself in order to make it pass more quickly. This trust in the temporary nature of discomfort is essential. Because one of the things that keeps people trapped in accommodation is the belief that if they set a boundary, if they cause upset, that upset will be permanent. That the relationship will be forever damaged. That the other person will never forgive them. And that belief makes setting boundaries feel impossibly risky. Because if the consequence is permanent damage, then maybe it is not worth it. Maybe it is better to just keep accommodating, keep adjusting, keep making yourself smaller in order to preserve the relationship. But this belief is rarely accurate. Most of the time, upset is temporary. Most of the time, when you set a boundary and someone is disappointed or frustrated, they adjust. They process their feelings and they move forward. The relationship continues, often stronger than before because it is now based on greater honesty. And even in the cases where someone does not adjust, where they cannot accept your boundary and the relationship changes or ends, that ending is often a reflection of the fact that the relationship was not sustainable as it was. That it was based on your willingness to accommodate, and without that accommodation, there was not enough genuine connection to sustain it. And recognizing this, recognizing that some relationships are built on unsustainable foundations, is part of the clarity that calm assertiveness brings. Because when you stop accommodating, when you stop performing, when you start showing up as yourself with your boundaries and your needs, you begin to see your relationships more clearly. You begin to see which ones are based on mutual respect and which ones are based on your willingness to sacrifice yourself. And while that seeing can be painful, it is also necessary. Because it allows you to make conscious choices about where you invest your energy, rather than giving it away to anyone who asks. This conscious choice, this ability to be selective about where you give your time and energy, is one of the ways that boundaries simplify your life. Because when you are clear about what you will and will not accept, when you are willing to let go of relationships that require you to abandon yourself, you create space for relationships that actually nourish you. Relationships where both people can be honest. Where both people can have needs. Where both people are allowed to have limits. And that space, that room for genuine connection, is what makes the discomfort of setting boundaries worth it. Because here is what many people discover on the other side of people-pleasing. The relationships that remain, the relationships that survive your boundaries, are better than the relationships you had before. They are more honest. They are more real. They are more sustainable. Because they are not based on performance. They are not based on your willingness to suppress your needs. They are based on both people showing up as they are, with their complexity and their limits and their imperfections. And that kind of relationship, while it may require more honesty and more navigation, is also more fulfilling. Because you are actually being seen. You are actually being known. Not the performance of you, but the real you. And this being seen, this being known, is what genuine intimacy looks like. It is what becomes possible when you stop hiding behind accommodation, when you stop managing how you are perceived, when you start trusting that you can be yourself and still be loved. Not loved for what you do, not loved for how well you accommodate, but loved for who you are. And that love, when you find it, when you allow it, when you trust it, is worth infinitely more than the approval you earn through endless adjustment. This is what calm assertiveness ultimately creates. Not a life without relationships, not a life without care or connection, but a life where those relationships are real. Where that care is genuine. Where that connection is based on honesty rather than performance. And that life, while it may require you to tolerate discomfort, while it may require you to set boundaries that feel risky, while it may require you to let go of relationships that cannot adjust, is a life that is truly yours. A life where you are not constantly managing, not constantly performing, not constantly abandoning yourself in the hope that if you are accommodating enough, you will finally feel secure. Because that security never comes from accommodation. It only comes from within. From the quiet, steady practice of honoring your truth. From the courage to set boundaries even when it feels uncomfortable. From the willingness to remain calm in the face of upset. From the trust that you can survive disappointment, conflict, even loss, and still be fundamentally okay. And that trust, once established, becomes unshakable. It becomes the foundation from which you navigate not just your relationships, but your entire life. With clarity. With integrity. With the quiet confidence that comes from knowing who you are and being willing to honor that, regardless of what anyone else thinks. There is something that happens when you have been practicing calm assertiveness for a while. You begin to notice patterns that were invisible before. You begin to see how certain situations, certain people, certain dynamics consistently pull you toward accommodation. And this noticing is not judgment. It is simply awareness. It is the ability to recognize, sometimes even before a conversation begins, that you are entering a space where your boundaries will be tested, where your clarity will be challenged, where the old impulse to please will arise. And in that recognition, you have a choice. You can prepare yourself. Not by rehearsing what you will say, not by building defenses, but by simply centering yourself in your truth. By reminding yourself that your boundaries are valid. That your needs matter. That you do not need to justify or defend or over-explain. And that simple internal preparation, that quiet centering, makes all the difference. Because you are not walking into the situation reactive or defensive. You are walking in grounded. Clear. Ready to honor what is true for you, regardless of how the other person responds. This preparation is not about anticipating conflict. It is about maintaining your center. About ensuring that you do not lose yourself in the interaction, that you do not get swept up in the other person's energy, that you remain connected to your own truth even when external pressure is applied. And that connection, that groundedness, is what allows calm assertiveness to function even in difficult situations. Even with people who are skilled at manipulation, at guilt-tripping, at finding the exact words that will make you doubt your boundary. Because those words will come. Those moments will arise. There will be times when someone says exactly the thing that activates your deepest fear, your oldest wound, your most vulnerable place. And in those moments, if you are not grounded, if you have not done the work of separating your worth from their reaction, you may falter. You may soften your boundary. You may accommodate despite knowing it is not right for you. Not because you want to, but because the fear is too strong, the old pattern too automatic, the pull toward people-pleasing too deeply embedded. But when you are grounded, when you have practiced returning to your center, when you have built a foundation of self-trust through repeated experience, those moments become navigable. They are still uncomfortable. They still activate the fear. But they do not control you. You can notice the fear, acknowledge it, and still choose to honor your boundary. You can feel the pull toward accommodation and still remain steady. You can hear the words designed to make you doubt yourself and still trust what you know to be true. This is the resilience that calm assertiveness builds. Not the absence of difficulty, not the elimination of discomfort, but the capacity to remain grounded even when things are hard. To hold your center even when external pressure is intense. To trust yourself even when others are questioning you. And that resilience, once developed, becomes something you carry with you into every interaction, every relationship, every situation where your boundaries might be tested. And over time, something else happens. The testing becomes less frequent. Because people learn. They learn that your boundaries are real, that pushing back does not work, that you mean what you say. And once they learn this, once they understand that you are not available for the old dynamic, they either adjust or they move on. And either outcome is acceptable. Because you are no longer willing to sacrifice your clarity for the illusion of harmony. You are no longer willing to abandon yourself in order to keep others comfortable. You have discovered that the only sustainable path forward is one where you remain true to yourself, and you are willing to accept whatever consequences come from that choice. This acceptance is freedom. It is the freedom to be yourself without apology. To have needs without guilt. To set boundaries without fear. And that freedom, while it may have required you to navigate discomfort, to tolerate uncertainty, to let go of relationships that could not adjust, is worth everything. Because it is the foundation of a life that is genuinely yours. And in that life, in that space where you are no longer performing, no longer adjusting endlessly to meet external expectations, something quieter emerges. It is not dramatic. It is not a sudden transformation. It is simply a sense of ease that was not there before. The ease of knowing that you do not need to monitor every interaction for signs of disapproval. The ease of trusting that your worth is not on the line every time you express a preference or decline a request. The ease of moving through your days without the constant background tension of wondering whether you are doing enough, being enough, accommodating enough. This ease is what people often do not expect when they begin setting boundaries. They expect conflict. They expect loss. They expect the relationships in their life to become more difficult. And while there may be an adjustment period, while some relationships may indeed become more complicated or even end, what emerges on the other side is often simpler than what came before. Because you are no longer carrying the weight of unspoken resentment. You are no longer navigating the confusion of unclear expectations. You are no longer exhausting yourself trying to be everything to everyone while losing touch with who you actually are. Instead, you are simply present. Present with yourself. Present with others. Present in a way that does not require constant management or performance. And that presence, that ability to simply be without the layers of accommodation and adjustment, is what allows genuine rest. Not the rest that comes from collapsing at the end of an exhausting day, but the rest that comes from no longer being at war with yourself. From no longer having to choose between your needs and your connections. From finally understanding that honoring yourself and caring for others are not in opposition, but are in fact inseparable. Because you cannot truly care for others from a place of depletion. You cannot offer genuine connection when you are performing. You cannot build sustainable relationships when you are constantly abandoning yourself to maintain them. And so the boundaries, the clarity, the calm assertiveness that felt so uncomfortable at first, become the very thing that makes real care possible. Real connection. Real relationships that do not require you to disappear in order to exist. This is the quiet gift of learning to honor yourself. Not that life becomes perfect, not that all conflict disappears, but that you are finally, fully present in your own life. No longer watching from the sidelines, waiting to see what others need before you know what to do. But grounded. Clear. Certain of your right to take up space, to have needs, to exist fully without apology. And that certainty, once found, does not leave. It becomes part of how you breathe, how you move, how you navigate the world. Steady. Calm. Unshakable.